and gentlemen, today I wanted to start by asking you a rhetorical question, so please don't answer it. What would you guys do if you know or knew that Jesus Christ was going to return to the earth at 3 p.m. tomorrow? This is a rhetorical question. A pastor that I have quoted before that I really do like, his name is John Wesley, had a response to this that I thought was interesting. Allegedly, somebody came up to him after a message and asked him this question, and when he responded to them was this. He pulled out his itinerary, he pointed at what he was going to be doing tomorrow, and he listed off the events that were going to come. So as we read about the events that are going to come and the events that have already happened in the book of Daniel, we must keep this one thought in the forefront of our mind. How does what we are reading change what happens with what we are given in our circumstances today and in our daily lives? I don't know if the PowerPoint's working on it. It looks a little skewed though. I accidentally hit a button on the PowerPoint before I came over here, and it totally altered the whole thing. So it's going to be an ugly PowerPoint today.
Did you change it to Word?
No, did he hit theme?
So I did hit the theme. We can learn from the life and the writings of Daniel what it looks like to respond in a godly manner to truth, and that being truth that we might not even fully be able to comprehend. So once again today we are going to be looking through a prophetic vision that God gave to Daniel, but instead of taking it all at once like blunt force trauma like we did last time, we are going to be breaking it down into different pieces. And so like chapter 7 did, there is a vision and then the angel gave Daniel an interpretation. We are covering chapter 8 today where there is a vision and then the angel Gabriel interprets the vision. So pay attention as we jump back and forth in between the two. Hopefully this is a better approach that better allows you to wrap your minds around what's going on. Okay, so the first section of the vision that we are going to cover is, of course, chapter 8, just looking at verses 1 through 4. Here's what verses 1 through 4 say. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam, and in the vision I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but it grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged towards the west, and the north, and the south. No animal could stand against it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and it became great. So that's the excerpt from the vision. I'm going to now jump forward to verse 19. We were just on 1 through 4. I'm jumping to 19 and 20, and this is where the angel Gabriel gives us the interpretation of the vision. He said, I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. So, that is the first little chunk of the vision that we have today, and it's not as insane as it was in chapter 7. It's pretty simple and straightforward, and the angel interprets it pretty clearly, but let's just go over it very quickly so that we get it in our minds. There's a ram. How many horns does it have?
2.
2 horns. And the angel later tells us it's what empire? The Middle Persian Empire. This kind of makes sense, right? You have a joint empire. You got the Medes and the Persians. And later on in the Medo-Persian conquest, the Persian Empire kind of overtook that of, I guess, the Medes. And so one nation rose above the other. And it tells us that this ram struck towards the west, the north, and the south. And if you look at the terrible image on the screen, you can see the different years.
Did you tell this?
Yeah, I made this. You can see the different years, maybe, and the different conquests that each of the different kings had. So it expanded towards the west, the north, and the south in these different directions. So that's pretty simple to understand. That is our first chunk of the vision. Let's take a look at the second chunk. This is verses 5 through 8. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. Take that into mind. It came towards the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and it charged at it in a great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. So, we have the ram in the beginning with 2 horns, and now we have a 1-horned goat. If the ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire, what is this 1-horned goat that defeats the Medo-Persian Empire?
It's a unicorn.
The Roman Empire.
It's a unicorn.
Greece!
Greece!
USA!
Greece, the left side is killing, the right
USA.
side is destroying
Exactly.
the left side.
The U.S.
It is Greece! Here's the interpretation that is listed in verses 21 and 22. It says the shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the horn between its eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from this nation, but will not have the same power. Now we have identified that this goat is Greece. Who do we believe that the one king is? The ruler, the 1 horn right in the middle.
Me. Me.
Alexander the Great.
Josh got it. Alexander
I said it last
the
time.
Great. Julia, did say it
For
loud.
you, Julia.
And she finished it. He
What
just
do you want, Bill?
It makes sense when it says in the vision that the goats crossed the whole earth without touching the ground, because Alexander was 21 when he began his conquest, and he had conquered pretty much the entire Medo-Persian Empire / most of the civilized world by the age of 26. He did it quickly and aggressively. If you look on the screen, you can see how Alexander's conquest came down from Greece, went down towards Egypt and stuff like that, worked his way around, and he pretty much took over most of the civilized world. That's his map. But then it tells us at the end of this little excerpt that this horn is broken off and 4 grow up to replace it. So let's see what it says, and then this is the next and the last little section of the vision that we have here today. Starting in verse 9, going to 12. Out of one of them came another horn. This is out of the 4 that were broken off from Alexander the Great. It started small, but it grew in power to the south and to the east and to the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw down some of the starry host to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and its sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything that it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. This is the last part of the vision here, and now I'm going to read the last part of the interpretation coming from 23 to 25. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will rise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation, and he will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, not by human power. So that's pretty much it for the content of the vision and the interpretation. Worked through it pretty quick. But now we have another little horn that is distinguished from the 4 that rose after the fall of Alexander the Great. The dude died at age 33. Tell me, is this little horn referencing the same little horn that we discussed 2 weeks ago in chapter 7? This is is a question. You guys are able to answer this one. Is this the same little horn? You don't have to have it flat out. Chris is going with maybe. I respect that answer. Anybody else? Yeah? That's good. I respect Chris's answer here, but let's take a look at it.
You respect it, but is that your answer?
Or we're going to find out.
We'll never know.
Historians have more or less identified the 4 prominent rulers that came up after Alexander the Great, because clearly his empire has somewhat been its old news. And there really is only one leader that does truly fit the description that is given in Daniel. And this fool's name is Antiochus. And he gave himself the title of Epiphanes. Now, the last name Epiphanes, do I have him on here? Yeah, look at that guy, Sean. The last name Epiphanes is not actually his last name. It's a name that he gave to himself, and it pretty much means God manifest. So this guy is full of himself. If we look at, where is it in the passage that we just covered? It says in verse 26 that he will consider himself superior. I think that name goes into that. But people do believe that Antiochus was the figure that was described here in chapter 8. For more reasons than just the fact that he gave himself this blasphemous name. I'm going to go through 3 of them. So Antiochus took over in the south and the east and towards the beautiful land, which at the time was, well, it still is, Israel, just like it says in the text. Another reason why we are led to believe that it is this man is because Antiochus set himself solely against God's chosen people, the Jews. Antiochus wanted to dominate regions that were heavily inhabited and influenced by Jewish culture. And so in order to promote his people to go against these people, he kind of set Jews apart as the enemy in order to get them on board with the program. And the last and probably the most prominent reason is that Antiochus outlawed all Jewish practices in his rule, including sacrifice, bless you, just like he said just like was said in this vision from the book of Daniel. He also deconsecrated the temple, just like it said here in the book of Daniel. And pretty much he essentially declared war on all God's people and his law. So, he was a bad guy, but I have a little excerpt here from a historian that we have covered before. This is a quote from Josephus, who was alive long before us. And he has written on the reign of Antiochus this: he compelled the Jews to dissolve the laws of their country and to keep their infants uncircumcised, and to sacrifice swine's flesh upon the altar, against which they all opposed themselves, and the most approving among them were put to death. Speaking of the Jews. Bacchides also, who was sent to keep the fortresses, having the wicked commands joined to his own natural barbarity, indulged all sorts of the extremest wickedness, and tormented the worthiest of inhabitants man by man, and threatened their city every day with open destruction, till at length he provoked the poor sufferers by the extremity of his wicked doings to avenge themselves. So, Antiochus was clearly a bad guy, definitely does fit the description that we have here in Daniel chapter 8. So, we've covered the whole of the vision that we are going to discuss today, but we aren't done. And there is one little part of the passage that I want to focus on, and this is Daniel's response. You'll notice after every vision that Daniel has, he kind of gives us a little excerpt. And today we are going to be looking intensely at verses 26 and 27. It's starting with the voice of the angel Gabriel, and what he says is, the vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. But seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Now Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business. But I was appalled by the vision, and I did not understand it. So just to recap those 2 verses. Daniel seals up the vision. He's overwhelmed and he gets sick. He does not understand it, and then he goes back to work, simply stated. Looking at Daniel's response to the vision that God gave him, I believe that we are able to formulate somewhat of a response of our own to the text that he has written out for us, that was given to us by God. And I want to make 3 points just based off of these 2 verses. The first point is that Daniel took what he could from what...
Oh my gosh! I worked hard on this thing. If you want to go up to, it was in design. If you hit design, right there, and then you just maybe hit a plain one.
Control Z.
Yeah, that's better, I guess. Yeah, that works.
Control Z twice.
That's fair.
That's okay.
I don't know why not.
Randomly hit a theme to change the
I had a theme as they were going to do worship, so I shouldn't have done that. I didn't think it was going to change the whole thing. Anyways, we're looking at Daniel's response now, and we are looking at the last 2 verses in the end, and I believe that they help us to formulate a response to things like this vision that he wrote to us. So, the first point that I want to make is that Daniel took from the vision what he could understand, and he left room for the stuff that he didn't understand. He had a space carved out for that, just like it says there in verse 27. My question to you guys is that, are you able to live with that? Can you live with some of the truth knowing that you don't have the whole thing, like Daniel was? Some of these visions that we've covered in both 7 and 8 have been fulfilled, as we looked at today. But not all of them. I also want to take this time to say that dual fulfillment of prophecy, and dual fulfillment means that something could be fulfilled twice, is a real thing. I'm not saying that about any specific text that we're talking about, but I just want to throw it out there. But are you guys allowing space for the truth and for truths that more or less go beyond our heads? And are we looking at what we can do with what we've been given and being okay with waiting on it? That's the first point. The second point, and these are just simple points that I'm pulling from the last 2 verses here. I have written on here, it overwhelmed him. And you might say, wow, that's elaborate and extreme.
We didn't get that when he said I was overwhelmed.
Okay. It overwhelmed him. This is the second point that I want to make. Why am I pointing this out? It's because Daniel clearly cared about the vision that the Lord gave him. Now, if you had a vision like Daniel's, you would probably maybe care a little bit more as well. However, he cared so much about this vision that he was in distress over it, and it more or less made the dude sick. I often find myself asking myself, if I truly believe in these prophecies from the book of Daniel, if I believe in the gospel message, and I do genuinely believe that one day Jesus Christ is going to return to judge the living and the dead, should it not have a little bit more impact on the life that I lead? Do I have the urgency or the heart to live with believers and to encourage them and to share the good news with the lost? How much compassion do you guys have for those who do not believe or those who don't know Christ? So it is clear that Daniel was overwhelmed by the vision and had compassion for the believers that were going to come in the time ahead of him. And I think that he felt a lot of kind of what I feel in my own mental anguish within myself. That's the second point. The third that I want to make is that then Daniel rose and went about the king's business. These are all very simple points to take, but it's important that we do not overlook them. He rose and he went about the king's business. Daniel had this dream with the goats and rams and stuff like that. They were going nuts, and then the angel was talking to him, and he was frightened and distressed. And what did he do about it? Daniel went right back and kept doing what he was already doing. This sounds a little bit familiar. Like Daniel, when he was asked the question, what would you do if you knew what was going to happen when the world ended? John Wesley answered the question, I am going to keep doing exactly what I was doing. Because John Wesley and Daniel were both already letting Christ rule in their hearts and in their lives. So, my question to you guys on this point is, are you guys living knowing that God is alive and active, that one day He will return to judge the living and the dead? And how are you living that out right now? So, I have written at the bottom here the main point of today's message, and I'm going to read it, but we're not going to be done. The main point of today's message is just that in view of what the future holds and what has already happened in the past and what God has already done, we have to live holy lives here and now. And I think through reading these prophetic visions in Daniel, this is the message we are to take away. But because there is a lot more here within the text, I have 3 more points for you guys. Are you still with me? I'm seeing glazed over faces and I'm monologuing, so I'm deviating up my voice so that you pay attention. That was just a start. Okay, 3 last points, and then we're going to discuss questions.
All caps.
Here. First point that I want to make, and it sounds a little bit strange, is that Satan cares about what you do. Strange point to make, but it is true. Evil is always an act against God. So in the text we see an evil man rising up against God's holy people. We see Antiochus, this guy who is attacking God. And what does he do? He does 3 different things. He bans sacrifice, he deconsecrates the temple, and he persecutes God's people ferociously. What does this tell you guys about your actions and the good works that you do to glorify God? What does it tell you? It tells you that the devil does not want you doing those things. He doesn't want you to glorify God because they are important and they steer you in a proper direction. If anything, the fact that Satan does care about what you do should drive you to believe that your everyday actions are important and can be used and are used by God. That's the first point. Satan cares about what you do. The second point is that sin, looking at this text, always will fall on itself. Sin, more or less, always involves stepping over the boundaries that God has set for us. Whether that be idolizing yourself, as we've seen here in the text, or seeking to gain all the power in the world like Alexander the Great. These boundaries that God has put in place are always there and there for a reason. To genuinely prosper, you have to be aligned with the person that is in control of all things. You have to be in line with the Creator. And those who are sinful are always going to fall short to the things that they cannot control. So sin always will fall on itself. Here's the last point, and then we're going to discuss it. And this one's the easiest to take. Self-control comes from God alone. Like Daniel, only those who have submitted themselves to God's Spirit have real self-control. Alexander the Great, Antiochus, or anybody seeking to control their own life always seem to head down the exact same path as the person before them. And that path always involves becoming a slave to one's passions and desires. Sin is often described, and I think I have it here on the screen, as filling a legitimate need with an illegitimate ends. What is the legitimate means to the end? The only way to truly fill your needs, to truly have control in your life, is by surrendering to the one that is control and can do work within you. People often think that self-control just means getting a rein on yourself and doing what you need to do for you. Self-control has a greater... self-control corresponds only to God because God is the only one that is in control. And so, Those 3 points can be derived from the end of this message here. But if you have taken nothing else away from today's message, know this, that in light of what the future holds and what God has already done in the past, these texts are calling us to live holy lives here and now. I'm going to pray, then let's discuss these things in our groups. And when you guys answer these questions, please try and answer them from the heart. The first one seems a little cliche, but try and answer it from the heart and be real with one another. So, pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much, God, for your word, God. I thank you that we are able to grapple with the things that we do not understand. I thank you for your mystery, God, that you are, incomprehensible, Lord. And I pray that we would allow space in each of our own personal theologies and understanding of you for your splendor and majesty that goes way over our heads, God. I pray that as these students read the book of Daniel, that it wouldn't just be a gloss over and that they would just read a bunch of stuff that's written on the page, but that they would recognize that this is your truth that has been fulfilled. And how amazing is that? But there is a prophetic word that has come to pass and is true. God, and I pray that we would take that knowledge, God, and that we would let it well up within us, God, and inspire us to trust in your word and to live out the things that are being spoken within it, God. I pray that each of these students would grapple with this personally, Lord, and help it not just to be something coming out of my mouth or in the church services on Sunday mornings, God. As always, God, let these students encounter you realistically and personally within their own lives, God. So please work in them, Holy Spirit, and draw them to you and your power, God. We thank you for all that you are doing in HSM, God. Please help us to be effective stewards of your word this week. Help us to take action even when it does seem difficult. Thank you for each and every one of the leaders here and that they are here ready and willing to serve you, God. Please bless our conversation and allow it to focus on what is the truth, God. We pray these things in your Son's name, who sacrificed himself so that we might have life. Amen.